Think your life is hard? You wouldn't last a single day in medieval times. Modern comforts have made us soft, and what medieval people dealt with daily would shock you to your core. Let's talk about medieval food, the stuff that would have you running back to the 21st century, faster than you can say McDonald's. First off, forget everything you've seen in movies about grand feasts with giant turkey legs. For regular folks, meals were bland, boring, and often dangerous. Most people led a diet that was about as exciting as watching paint dry. Peasants lived mainly on something called pottage, basically a sad watery soup, made from whatever vegetables they could grow, cooked in the same pot for days. It was the medieval version of Mom's mystery stew. Except instead of hiding vegetables, it was hiding weevils and dirt. Bread was the main food for almost everyone, but it wasn't the fluffy sliced stuff we enjoy today. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often filled with all sorts of unwanted extras. The flour used was typically ground between stone wheels that would chip off into the mix. People back then had stronger teeth, not from good genes, but from constantly chewing on what was basically rock-filled dough. Here's a terrifying fact. Much of the bread contained ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, burning sensations, and sometimes death. Some historians believe ergot poisoning may have contributed to witch hunt hysteria, because entire towns would start hallucinating at once. Imagine thinking your neighbor is a witch, when really, your baker just needed to clean his equipment. Meat was a luxury for most people. When they did get it, it was often borderline rotten. Because there was no refrigeration to mask the taste of spoiling meat, they used heavy spices if you could afford them. Otherwise, you just held your nose and hoped for the best. The 5-second rule in medieval times was more like the 5-day rule. The worst part, you couldn't even wash down this awful food with water, because drinking it would make you sick. Most water sources were contaminated with human waste and other nasty stuff. Instead, everyone, including kids, drank beer or ale. Not the strong stuff we have today, but a weaker version that was safer than water, because the brewing process killed germs. One study found that the average medieval peasant consumed about 8 pints of ale per day. Children as young as 5 regularly drank ale with every meal. Medieval kids didn't need to fake IDs to drink, they needed them to get water instead. Fish was another common food, but usually preserved by drying or salting, since fresh fish spoiled quickly. People living by the coast might get fresh fish, but for inland dwellers, fish arrived days or weeks old. The smell alone would knock you out. By now your stomach is probably turning, which brings us perfectly to the next medieval horror. For the average person, going to the bathroom meant using a chamber pot, basically just a bowl or bucket kept under the bed. Once filled, you either empty it yourself or wait for someone to collect it. Where did they empty it? Usually right out the window and into the street below. The medieval version of Look Out Below wasn't about falling objects, but falling feces. The common practice in towns was to simply shout, "Garde à l'eau," before tossing waste from upper windows. This warning came from the French phrase garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. Of course, by water, they meant something far less pleasant. This practice was so common that in some medieval cities, the rule was that waste could only be thrown from windows after 10 at night. If you were lucky enough to visit a castle, you might encounter something called a garderobe, essentially a hole in a stone seat that dropped waste straight down the castle wall. In Dover Castle, archaeologists found a garderobe that dropped waste nearly 70 feet. Kings and queens might have had thrones, but their toilets were just holes with the draft. For those who couldn't wait to get home to their chamber pot, the options were grim. Public areas often had designated spots where people would relieve themselves, creating what we'd now call open sewers. In London, there were places called common privies, built over rivers, but these were few and far between. The job of collecting and disposing of human waste fell to workers with the unfortunate title of gone farmers. These brave souls would collect waste from cesspits and take it outside the city walls. They could only work at night, and the smell clung to them so badly they weren't allowed in public gathering places. Despite the awful conditions, gone farmers were actually paid quite well, about 4 times what an ordinary laborer made. The smell of medieval cities was legendary. The River Thames in London was so polluted with waste that it was described as a monster of stink. Toilet paper, forget about it. People used whatever was available: leaves, moss, their left hand, or if they were wealthy, pieces of wool or hemp. The Romans had actually used sponges on sticks that they would rinse in vinegar or salt water, but that knowledge was mostly lost by medieval times. After spending a day drinking ale to avoid waterborne illness, and then finding nowhere decent to relieve yourself, you'd be ready to head back to the 21st century. But the bathroom situation was just one of many brutal realities that made medieval life a daily test of survival. Forget those romantic notions of being a valiant knight or a fair maiden in a castle. In medieval times, most people worked back-breaking jobs from sunrise to sunset, with barely enough pay to survive. Most people were peasant farmers who worked the land owned by nobles. Their daily routine: wake up at dawn, work until dusk, collapse into bed, repeat until death. A typical farmer plowed fields using wooden tools, pulled by oxen, planted seeds by hand, and harvested crops with basic sickles. During harvest season, peasants worked 16-hour days in the baking sun. Records from medieval England show that a typical farm worker would burn over 4,000 calories daily, just from physical labor. Medieval farmers didn't need gym memberships, they just needed to survive Tuesday. For those not farming, trades and crafts offered alternative careers, though these came with their own hardships. Blacksmiths spent their days in smoke-filled forges, breathing in toxic fumes and risking burns and eye injuries. Tanners, who turned animal hides into leather, worked with urine and toxic chemicals that turned their skin yellow and gave them horrible smells that followed them everywhere. Want to become a skilled tradesperson? Better start young. Apprenticeships typically began at age 7, when children would be sent to live with a master craftsman. These young apprentices worked 6 or 7 days a week for up to 14 years before they could become journeymen. Medieval career counselors had a pretty simple job selection flow chart. Can you lift heavy things? If yes, farmer. If no, early death. Some jobs were designed specifically for the poor and desperate. Link boys were children who carried torches to light the way. For wealthy people at night, Terror finders collected dog feces to sell to tanners. The pay for most jobs would barely cover basic survival. A day laborer in medieval England might earn 1 or 2 pennies per day, just enough to buy about 2 loaves of bread. Getting paid minimum wage wasn't a concept. The concept was minimum you need, so you don't die before finishing your work. With such physically demanding work and poor nutrition, your body would wear out quickly. Disease was everywhere. Medicine was practically non-existent, and what passed for healthcare would today be considered torture. Medieval WebMD had just one diagnosis for everything: you're probably going to die. A simple cold or flu that we treat with rest and over-the-counter medicine could be a death sentence without understanding of germs or infection. Medieval people believed illness came from bad air or an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Got a fever? Time for bloodletting. This involved cutting open a vein and draining blood into a bowl. Medieval doctors had one solution for everything: you've got too much blood, let me fix that for you. Leeches were another popular treatment. These blood-sucking parasites were applied to the skin to draw out bad blood. One medical text recommended using 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. The mortality rate from disease was staggering. About 30% of children died before age 5, and the average life expectancy was between 30 and 40 years. The bubonic plague killed roughly 50% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Dental problems were particularly awful. With no proper toothbrushes or understanding of dental hygiene, tooth decay was common. Medieval dentists didn't need appointments, they just waited until someone was screaming loud enough to be heard through town, and even the medicines that were available were often deadly. Mercury was prescribed for everything from skin conditions to syphilis. Their prescription drugs didn't need warning labels about side effects. The side effect was always, might kill you faster than the disease. The worst part: many diseases spread because of poor understanding of hygiene. Their idea of hand sanitizer was wiping their palms on their already filthy clothes, which is like trying to clean a muddy shoe with a dirty sock. Even if you somehow survived all these medieval medical treatments, your troubles were far from over. Life in the Middle Ages found plenty of other ways to make each day a challenge. Justice in medieval times wasn't just blind, it was downright cruel, unfair, and often completely random. The legal system operating on principles that would make modern lawyers scream in horror. First off, laws varied wildly from one town to the next. What was perfectly legal in one village could get you thrown in a dungeon just 5 miles away. There were no standardized legal codes, and most common people had no idea what was actually against the law until they were accused of breaking it. Medieval Miranda rights consisted of: you have the right to be punished, you have the right to beg for mercy. Good luck with that, the punishment rarely fit the crime. Minor offenses, like stealing food when you were starving, could result in having a hand chopped off. In medieval England, over 200 different crimes carried the death penalty, including cutting down a tree in the King's Forest or stealing property worth more than 12 pence. Trials were nothing like our modern court system. If you were accused of a crime, proving your innocence often involved trial by ordeal. One common method was making the accused carry a red, hot iron bar for 9 feet. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were innocent. If they became infected, which was almost guaranteed without modern medicine, you were guilty. Their version of a lie detector test was basically, let's see if God stops this painful thing from hurting you. Another popular method was trial by water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river or lake. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and executed. The logic, water being pure, would reject the guilty. This created a literal no-win situation for the accused. For those found guilty, execution methods were designed to be as public and terrifying as possible. Hanging was actually one of the more merciful methods. Drawing and quartering, where the condemned was dragged through streets by horses, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded and then cut into 4 pieces, was reserved for the worst crimes, like treason. Public executions were community events, often drawing huge crowds who brought food and drinks, as if attending a festival. Medieval entertainment options were limited. You could watch someone being executed, or stay home and stare at your wall. Most people chose the execution. Nobles rarely faced the same justice system as commoners. If a noble was accused of a crime, they could often demand trial by combat and hire a professional fighter to represent them. Rich criminals could also pay blood money to victims' families to avoid punishment. Meanwhile, poor people accused of crimes had virtually no defense options. What about jails? Medieval prisons weren't meant for long-term punishment. They were holding cells until your actual punishment could be carried out. These dungeons were dark, overcrowded pits where prisoners were often chained to walls or floors. No food was provided by the state. Prisoners relied on family members to bring meals, or they simply starved. Torture was a standard part of the legal process, used not just for punishment, but to extract confessions. Devices like the rack, which stretched limbs until joints dislocated, the Iron Maiden, or a coffin-like container lined with spikes and thumb screws, which crushed fingers, were used to get confessions, true or false. Most people confessed to anything just to end the torture, which usually led to execution anyway. The medieval justice system's motto might as well have been confess or suffer, then suffer anyway. Public humiliation was a common punishment for minor offenses. Being locked in the stocks meant sitting in a public square with your head and hands trapped between wooden boards, while townspeople threw rotten food, mud, and worse at you. The ducking stool was used mainly for women accused of gossiping or arguing with their husbands. They would be strapped to a chair and repeatedly dunked underwater. Medieval law enforcement was equally primitive. There were no professional police. Towns hired night watchmen, who were often elderly men considered too old for regular work. Their main duty was to raise the alarm if they spotted a crime or fire. Medieval cops didn't read you your rights. They just shouted "Stop thief" and hoped someone in the crowd would stick out a leg to trip you. Even if you were innocent, simply being accused of a crime could ruin your life. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Once accused, you were basically presumed guilty, and the burden was on you to somehow prove otherwise through these horrific ordeals or trials. If the legal system didn't kill you, perhaps you'd survive long enough to experience another medieval terror. Medieval warfare was nothing like what you see in movies. Forget glorious battles with shining knights charging across open fields. Real medieval combat was chaotic, brutal, and almost certainly fatal for the average person. Wars happened constantly. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, fighting dragged on from 1337 to 1453. That's 116 years of on and off conflict. The average medieval person would experience multiple wars during their lifetime, unlike today, where many people live their entire lives without seeing combat firsthand. Let's talk about armor. Only the wealthiest knights could afford full plate armor, which cost roughly the equivalent of a modern sports car. A complete set of plate armor represented about 2 to 3 years' worth of income for a skilled craftsman. Most soldiers wore padded cloth garments, called gambesons, perhaps with a few metal plates sewn on. If they were lucky, knights in shining armor, with a medieval version of people with expensive sports cars. Rare, showing off and probably compensating for something. What about weapons? Swords were expensive, and primarily used by knights and nobility. Common soldiers used spears, axes, or agricultural tools modified for fighting. The most feared medieval weapon was actually the longbow, which could pierce most armor at close range. English longbowmen trained from childhood, developing deformed skeletons from the physical stress of drawing 200-pound bows. Thousands of times, medieval battles were incredibly lethal. At the Battle of Totton in 1461, roughly 28,000 men died in a single day. About 1% of England's entire male population. Many froze to death in the snowstorm that accompanied the battle before they ever saw combat. Battle wounds were almost always fatal due to infection, even if they weren't immediately life-threatening. For peasants, the worst part of war wasn't even the battles, it was what armies did between fights. Medieval armies lived off the land, meaning they took whatever food and supplies they needed from local villages. This often involved burning crops, killing livestock, and destroying homes. Soldiers from both sides would ransack communities, leaving civilians to starve. The medieval version of support. Our troops meant, please don't take all our food and burn our houses. Sieges were particularly horrific. When an army surrounded a castle or walled town, those trapped inside faced slow starvation. During the Siege of Paris in 885 to 886, inhabitants resorted to eating rats, cats, and eventually each other. Sieges could last months or even years. The Siege of Candia, or modern Heraklion, during the 1600s lasted 21 years, the longest siege in history. Disease killed far more soldiers than actual fighting. Armies created perfect conditions for illness. Thousands of men living in close quarters with poor sanitation, limited food, and contaminated water. During the Crusades, European armies often lost half their men to disease before ever reaching their destination. Medieval army medics had to treatments, rub some dirt on it for minor wounds, and prepare to meet your maker for everything else. Civilians caught in war zones faced terrible choices. Fleeing meant abandoning homes and possessions, possibly facing starvation on the road. Staying meant risking violence from passing armies. Women and children weren't spared. Medieval chronicles describe entire villages being slaughtered, regardless of age or gender. If somehow you managed to avoid getting drafted into these bloody conflicts, survived the roaming armies, and didn't starve from war-caused famines, you'd still have to endure the general misery of everyday medieval life. The smell hit you first. Medieval towns reeked of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, tanning chemicals, slaughterhouse remains, and smoke from countless fires. Without garbage collection, trash piled up on streets, or was tossed into the nearest river. Butchers dumped animal entrails and blood right outside their shops. The smell was so overwhelming that people carried small pouches of herbs, called pomanders, to hold under their noses. The medieval version of air freshener was slightly less terrible smelling stuff to mask the horrible smelling stuff. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. Most people bathed only a few times a year, usually in spring and at the end of summer. Many believed that bathing opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. During winter months, people might go 4 to 5 months without washing. Head lice were so common that special combs for removing them were standard grooming tools. Medieval dating profiles would have included only moderate lice infestation. As a major selling point, clothing was uncomfortable, rarely washed and worn until it fell apart. Undergarments were made of rough linen that irritated the skin. Outer garments were heavy wool that itches constantly. Both rich and poor typically own only 2 or 3 sets of clothes total. Shoes were made of thin leather with flat soles that provided no protection from the elements. The language barrier would be nearly insurmountable. Middle English from the 1400s sounds almost like a foreign language to modern English speakers. Common phrases like "why it is thin nama" or "what is your name" would be incomprehensible. You'd struggle to understand others, and they'd think you were speaking gibberish. Privacy didn't exist. Most households consisted of one room, where everyone ate, worked, and slept together. Beds were shared by multiple family members, and sometimes travelers would share beds with strangers at inns. Even wealthy homes had servants present at all times, including during private moments. Entertainment options were limited and often violent. Public executions drew large crowds and were treated as festivals. Animal baiting, where dogs would attack chained bears or ghouls, was popular. Less violent options included watching traveling performers or listening to bards tell stories, but these were infrequent treats. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. The feudal system meant everyone had a fixed place, and social mobility was nearly impossible. About 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing and worked land belonging to nobles. Moving up in the station or changing occupations rarely happened. Knowledge was limited and superstition filled the gaps. Most people believed in witches, demons, and magical creatures. Medical problems were attributed to evil spirits, dead air, or astrological influences. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into panic, believing the world was ending. Medieval fact-checking consisted of asking the oldest person in the village if they'd heard the same thing before. Communication was slow and unreliable. News traveled at the speed of a walking messenger or horseback rider. Information from 50 miles away might take days to arrive, and news from other countries could take months if it arrived at all. By this point in our journey through medieval horrors, you'd be desperately searching for a way back to your comfortable modern life with its antibiotics, indoor plumbing, human rights, and deodorant. The past may seem romantic in books and movies, but the reality of medieval life was a daily struggle that few of us modern humans could endure, even for a day.